Right, so this is a demonstration on making brioche. So here we can see the ingredients for the brioche. I've got the flour already in the bowl, out of the cool room, so it's cold, and the yeast is in the bowl. And then we have our, I guess you can call them not micro ingredients, but all the other ingredients that are needed for this brioche. So sugar, milk powder, got a little tiny bit of bread improver, and salt. Now the salt is reduced to 1%. You can see that it's got a fair bit of sugar. I think it's running at about 8%. Just with the milk powder too, I see in a lot of older recipes for yeast, like enriched doughs, where they use milk. Milk has an enzyme that conflicts a little bit with fermentation, so it's recommended to use either skim milk powder or full cream milk powder is a better option. I've got the water chilled, sitting at 5 degrees. We've got our egg content, right? So this is an enriched dough. A brioche is, a very enriched, soft French-style bread. And you can see here the volume of butter that is mixed into the dough. So the butter is cold. I don't use soft room temperature butter for these types of doughs because the whole concept of this dough is to keep it cold. It makes it very difficult to mold and to handle this dough because of the fat content. When the ingredients are at room temperature. So this dough is for tomorrow. So it'll have 24 hours in the cool room. So in this case, for this dough, we're using 100% of the eggs, and then the water will be the variable sort of ingredient. Eggs in. And again, want to be able to form a dough in that first 3 minutes. Water. So this is an exam dough. So we've got for this week's classes, we will be doing brioche, which is in the final exam. We'll also be doing sabrin, rhubarb. That is in the assessment. And I'm also going to put a dough in, which is the batard. So we can practice that dough, practice the molding, the bulk fermenting, the scaling, and the molding. And that'll give us just another practice for that assessment. So just in the reverse cycle. Now going forward again. That reverse cycle is just very handy to help form a dough. Now, when this dough first starts to come together, it looks really tight. It looks like it's not right. And the reason for that is it has such a high volume of butter. So as soon as I can see that I'm starting to form a dough, starting to form gluten, and the important thing with this is that with this type of dough, and the influence of fat on gluten. So if I add fat at the beginning of the dough making phase, the fat will hinder the gluten forming proteins forming a strong network. If I form gluten first and then I add fat to that dough, then I've got a situation where the fat will sit outside of that gluten matrix. So it doesn't really affect the really strong gluten network that we need. So as soon as it hits that second speed, which is dough development, start adding butter. Cold butter. What that'll do is, as it starts to like defrost, I guess, and become pliable, it'll then start blending into the dough. Soft butter just is problematic, really. Problematic for us to handle the dough. It also doesn't give a really good indication. And I'm talking about the look of the dough, of how it should really look, because it's so soft and elastic. So for these types of fat-enriched doughs, I really recommend everything as cold as possible. Because it'll sit in the cool room for 24 hours, but also it's better if it's really cold, because we don't want to kickstart fermentation. And then when we go to mold this brioche, it's in such a better situation for us because we are beginners with our molding techniques. It just makes it so much easier to mold that dough. In industry, it's industry practice to make brioche or these types of fat-enriched doughs way before they're processed. So whether it's bulk fermented for some hours or whether it's 24 hours, colder the better. So you can see the butter's starting to blend in. We've got it all in. It's taken about 2 minutes. You can see that it's still working those pieces of butter in. But also you can see the color influence from the butter as well, and the eggs too. So I guess good opportunities to talk about the role of ingredients and what each ingredient brings to the table with this type of dough. So essentially with the brioche, historically, there was 3 types of brioche. There was a poor person's brioche, which had limited amount of eggs and a limited amount of butter, because you've got to remember back, when this sort of historical bread was made commercially, butter and eggs were, they were very expensive and exclusive ingredients. So there was like a lower class type of brioche, which had limited eggs and limited fat. Then you had a middle class brioche, which had then, eggs and fat, sugar, and then a rich person's, or, nearly, I would suggest, royalty brioche, where it had maximum butter, maximum sugar, maximum eggs. This brioche that we're making here, I would say, would sit like in that high end. It's got a lot of fat. So at the moment, like the percentages based on the flour, we're running 30% butter to flour. and we're running 30% eggs to flour. That might just give you a bit of an idea of how enriched this is. So the butter is bringing to that dough high extensibility, lots of flavor, a very soft closed crumb, color, and shelf life. More fat, longer the shelf life. The more leaner the dough, the shorter the shelf life. The eggs, we're using whole eggs. That is also bringing protein, because there's protein in egg whites. In the yolk, we're getting the color and flavor. The lecithin element to the egg yolk, that probably doesn't really have a function, but certainly the protein will help with the structure of the brioche, considering that egg whites have protein and they will coagulate in the oven. And considering that the gluten protein in the flour's got a lot of work to do to try and help contain all of this fat and sugar. The sugar that's in the dough is responsible for certainly a softness in the crumb. It definitely has an extensible effect on the gluten, makes it able to stretch a lot more than lean doughs. It'll bring color through caramelization, and it'll also enhance shelf life. So sugar will, that will lock onto the available water in that dough and bread piece. So that also has like a function in the brioche for shelf life with the fat. We've got the milk powder. So we're using full cream milk powder. So yes, there's some protein to be had as well in the milk powder. Of course, more color, more flavor. And I might have mentioned that it's not recommended using fresh milk in yeasted doughs. Just going to add another minute. And I'll talk about the mixing time after the ingredient functionality. Yeah, it's not recommended using fresh milk in yeasted dough. So milk powder is a way better choice for that. The salt was reduced. So in the doughs that we were making that were lean doughs or white doughs, we were running at 2% salt. In this case, we've got just 1% salt, and that's because we've got 10% sugar. So whenever you've got a conflict, not a conflict, but when you're, the sugar and the salt are competing also with the water content in this dough that's required for fermentation. So when we've got that situation, we need to reduce one of those and also then increase the yeast. So in standard white breads, we were running with 2% yeast, and in this brioche dough, we've got 5% yeast. So a lot more yeast than the other white breads that we have been making. And the last bit is that bread improver. Why is it in there? And that's a good question. Why is it in there when we're putting this dough over 24 hours? The bread improver is just to help that recovery process, meaning that if I want to freeze this dough, and we will be doing that in some cases for the assessment, then that bread improver is in there just to help kickstart that fermentation and help that recovery process to recover and improve. So now just on the mixing, just going to let that finish to the minute. I'm just going to have a look. So that's now been mixing for 9 minutes. Now, just a bit of scrape. Still nice and cold. Just take that opportunity to take a dough temperature as well. Just remember with the dough temp that we are using the full thermometer, meaning push that probe all the way. Let's take a bit of dough, and it's very soft, very elastic, as you would expect with such an enriched dough. And you can see where at that point I made about making this dough on the day, putting it in our in our fridge, and after an hour, it's still too soft to be able to mold this correctly. So you can see that the gluten still needs to develop more. So when I put my, I do the window test, you see it breaks very easy. And the other thing is it looks quite rough. So I'll use that word again, that doughs, patisserie, mousses, all those sort of things need to be shiny. And with brioche, so I'll go to 10 minutes. With brioche and these fat-enriched doughs, what we really want to see on the bottom of the bowl is that it starts to release itself from the bottom of the bowl, meaning instead of sticking to the bottom, it's releasing itself completely from the bowl, which is an indication that gluten is fully formed. The dough temperature was 17 degrees, so I can afford to mix longer. Just remember with that dough temperature, really that, for these types of doughs, once you get really above 21, 22, that's probably the recommendation. Otherwise, you don't want to kickstart fermentation, right? We want to be able to bulk ferment this dough for 24 hours. Therefore, to be really cold, easy to handle, easy to mold. We do our pieces, and for the brioche, we're making Parisians. We'll be doing a roll, molding type called a Kaiser roll. And that will be our savory brioche bun. And then we're also doing a brioche loaf. And then if we get time, we'll also do a brioche tart. So there's a selection of items that you would probably see in patisseries or restaurants, or certainly in France, where this is a staple, and it is a French bread. They are the cultural shapes and sizes of those bread pieces. You can see with the dough now, it looks a bit different. So you can get nice little swirls. Gluten is definitely forming. Going now to 13 minutes, and really just wanting that to release itself from the bottom. It's pretty close. Just going to give that one more scrape. So a minute. Check the temperature again. Just making sure all that dough is in there. Just sort of release it a bit. So I'm sitting at 20 degrees. So I think that minute will probably do it. Now I'm just going to check for gluten development. And you can see those two bits of data. So temperature, mixing time, and the window test. They're the I guess the tools that and the baker experience that we use. So you can see a lot better. Right, very clear. I'm going to mix it for 1 minute. And then the bulk fermented system will start. And this is the dough that we'll be using for Tuesday class. The Tuesday class will make the dough for the Wednesday class. The Wednesday class will make the dough then to freeze over the break. We'll have a look at frozen yeast for that one and explain why we use different type of yeast for freezing doughs. So we still make the dough, but the way I'm showing you is industry standard. Okay, it's not, these doughs aren't normally made on the day. They're made well in advance because they're normally rolled, and sometimes they go through the sheeter. Sometimes they even laminate brioche, right? So there's a whole bunch of reasons why using a very cold dough is recommended. So that looks really nice. See how it's nice and shiny now? It's released itself from the bowl. See that, like, it's just a little tiny bit of sticking on there. I'm going to give it another 30 seconds. And that should definitely do it. So they're the signals releasing from the bowl, dough temperature, and that window test. That mixing time was 3 minutes first. I added the butter once it had formed the dough. And then that was then developing a lot longer than our white bread. So that was developing nearly for 14 minutes. That looks great. It's nice and shiny. Let's check the window again. Check for dough temperature. Yeah, it feels very nice. So I can stretch this out. When you do the window test, just nice and easy. And don't, a lot of students want to, mush it up into a ball. Really, you just want to cut that piece. Don't play around with it. Start stretching it and just gently stretch it out. It feels so silky. And you can see really nice development. I could probably, you know what? I could probably mix it for about another 30 seconds, but that's very nice development. The reason that I won't, though, however, is it's 21.9 degrees, and I don't want to go over 22. I'll post again with the molding techniques for this brioche. So you've got the two things, the two really important parts of this brioche: how to make the dough, how to bulk ferment the dough, but how to mold the dough.